Variation and natural selection. Variation is the differences between individuals within the same species. There are two distinct types of variation: discontinuous variation and continuous variation. Discontinuous variation is a variation that is only affected by the genetics or the genotypes. For example, the blood groups, which have a definite answer. For example, blood group A, B, AB, or O, or whether they can roll their tongue or not. While continuous variation is a variation that is affected by the genes and also the environment. So for example, in this picture, you can see that they have similar height. This is the example of continuous variation, since the environment affects their height. But their gender is discontinuous variation. For example, some are male and some are female. The first type of variation is the genetic variation, which is basically a variation due to the differences in genotypes. For example, blood groups, which are controlled by the genes. This may also affect the hair color, eye color, heights, and many other characteristics. So for example, in this picture, this cattle has large horns, while the cattle on the bottom doesn't have horns. This is controlled by a dominant allele of gene. For example, the polled or the hornless cattle have 2 copies of the recessive allele of this gene. The next step is the environmental variation. So the environmental variation is the variation not caused by the genotypes, but instead is caused by the variation. For example, the pine trees are eligible to grow reaching 30 meters tall. But if it is grown in a very small pot and its roots are regularly pruned, they will not be able to grow 30 meters. For example, the bonsai tree. The bonsai tree, when compared to the pine tree, is nothing. This is because it is grown in a very small pot and it is continuously pruned. So in general, discontinuous variation is caused by genes alone. Continuous variation is often influenced by both genes and environment. So the causes of genetic variation. This is how new alleles are formed, and it is the source of brand new characteristics in the gene pool. So basically, mutations are the source of all genetic variation. Xerophytes are plants that live in the desert, which can easily run short of water, especially in high temperatures. The plants such as succulents and cacti must be well adapted to survive these difficult conditions. For example, the first one is by closing stomata. So plants can easily lose water through the stomata. So they adapt by closing the stomata. Next one is by having a waxy cuticle. So the waxy cuticle will prevent water to escape to evaporation. So they have a thick layer of waxy cuticle on the leaves of the xerophytes. Hairy leaves will be able to help the plant trap moist air. Stomata on the underside of the leaf will allow, it's usually cooler than if it is on the upper side of the leaf, so less water will be able to evaporate. Cutting down the surface area so that not a lot of heat energy is trapped and caught by the plant's leaves, preventing high levels of photosynthesis. Having deep or spreading roots to find water sources underground to be able to survive and photosynthesize. On the other hand, hydrophytes are plants that live in very wet places. These plants have no problem with water shortage, but this doesn't mean they do not need to have other adaptations. The roots of water do not attach to the bed of the river or the pond where they grow, but they just float freely in the water. The stems and leaf stalks have hollow spaces in them, filled with air, which help them to float. The top of the water, where they can get plenty of light for photosynthesis. They have stomata on both surfaces to allow to absorb carbon dioxide from the air for photosynthesis. The cuticle on the upper and lower surfaces of the leaf is much thinner in plants, since they have no problem with water shortages, so evaporation will instead help them for cooling. So next we will be talking about the selection, or also known as natural selection, presented by Darwin's theory of how evolution could have happened in the world. First is the variation. So most organisms contain individuals which vary slightly from one to another. Some variations may be advantageous and some may not be. Overproduction. Most organisms produce more young than will survive through adulthood. Struggle for existence. Since the population is increasing rapidly, therefore there is a considerably competition for survival between the organisms. Survival of the fittest. Which of the organisms is best adapted will survive. Advantageous characteristics passed on to the offspring. So only the most well-adapted adults will be able to have offspring that will survive, since it will inherit the adapted genetics. Gradual change. So over a period of time, the population will lose all the poorly adapted individuals. The population will gradually become better adapted to its environment. The theory is often called the theory of natural selection because it suggests that the best adapted organisms are selected to pass on the characteristics to the next generation. We can describe evolution as the change in adaptive features over time as a result of natural selection. The peppered moths can be a good example of the natural selection. Up until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the pale moths had the advantage, as they were better camouflaged to the lichen-covered tree trunks. So, at first there were an equal number of dark and pale pepper moths, and there were an equal number of each moth were released to polluted wood and unpolluted wood. After a few days, we can see that in the polluted wood, the dark moths survived more. And in the unpolluted wood, the pale speckled moths can survive better. The only explanation to this is because the dark moths are better camouflaged to the polluted wood, and the speckled moths are better camouflaged to the unpolluted wood. So in the 19th century, where most parts of Britain is the Industrial Revolution happening, there are only polluted woods around. As a result, the pale speckled moths almost go extinct. Sickle cell anemia is a good example of how natural selection can work in humans. Some people have a mutation in the gene that codes for the production of hemoglobin. But mutations can occur, and it can create a faulty hemoglobin. This changes the amino acid sequence in the hemoglobin, preventing the hemoglobin working as it should. This faulty hemoglobin has a tendency to produce fibers inside the red blood cells. When oxygen concentration is low, the red blood cells get pulled into a sickle shape and get stuck in the blood capillaries. The last one is about selective breeding. So, selective breeding, or also known as artificial natural selection, is where humans are in control of the selection. This may be done to get specific features humans want from the organisms. For example, wild and cultivated apples. So wild apples will be small in size and maybe green in color, which is unappetizing, but humans can do selective breeding by choosing the correct color apples and breeding them with the largest apples to produce a large and good colored apple. Another one is cattle. Some cattle may be bred for the horn or the leather skin, while others may be born for the milk. So this is done by selective breeding. So the farmers will get the males with the largest horns and the females with the best leather to produce offspring of the best two qualities.